thank you for joining us. If anybody dials in late, then they'll certainly be let in from the lobby. But so thank you for joining us. Good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate you joining us here at WestonAndSampson for our latest webinar. This one on trending PFAS topics in Connecticut. We hope it'll be a useful and informative hour for all of you. A few housekeeping items before we get going, though. First, this webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording along with a PDF of the slide deck available afterwards. Second, all attendees are muted. There is no chat function, just the Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments, please put them in there, and I'll be keeping track of them, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. And finally, contact information for each of our speakers will be available at the end of the presentation in case there are questions or anything else that you'd like to share outside the scope of this webinar. And if we don't have a chance to get to all of the questions, then the speakers, one or more of the speakers will get back to you after the webinar. Now, in terms of the speaker bios, first speaker, Linda Cook, is a senior technical leader and environmental chemist and data scientist with WestonAndSampson. She has more than 35 years of experience specializing in the analysis, assessment, and interpretation of environmental chemistry data. For the past several years, most of her project work has supported clients to help them overcome the challenges associated with generating reliable PFAS chemistry data and to help them interpret the data in support of project objectives and source identification. Secondly, Steve LaRosa is also a senior technical leader and geologist at WestonAndSampson. He has over 30 years of experience and is frequently invited to speak on PFAS-related topics like water and wastewater treatment, biosolids, landfill leachate, and others. He has designed and overseen the implementation of sampling and evaluation of PFAS contaminant sources and its impacts at dozens of projects throughout the East Coast. He frequently interfaces with state and regional officials and EPA and citizen stakeholders to optimize project outcomes, and has presented PFAS contaminant-related talks at dozens of professional meetings and conferences. And last but certainly not least, Malcolm Bieler, also a technical leader at WestonAndSampson, is based out of our Rocky Hill, Connecticut office. He is a chemist and civil and environmental engineer with over 30 years of experience in site investigation and remediation. He has investigated numerous sites with PFAS impacts in Connecticut and has been working with Connecticut DEEP on the development of surface water protection criteria and other additional polluting substance standards to achieve site closure. With that, I'll hand it over to Linda. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks for joining us today. As you know, we'll be discussing PFAS and topics relevant to the state of Connecticut, including regulations, test methods, and discussing some state-level data. There are some topics we're going to touch at just at a high level today. If you'd like any more detailed information about any topic, please feel free to reach out, and we'd like to follow up with you. So like so many great scientific discoveries, PTFE, which we commonly known as Teflon, was discovered by accident while Dr. Plunkett at DuPont was working with refrigerants. The material he discovered was inert to almost all chemicals and was very slippery. There were no other compounds or materials that had these same attributes. So at the time, these compounds were considered to be miraculous. And it's because of these unique properties that PFAS compounds have been used for decades in a wide variety of applications, from firefighting foam to stain resistance in textile, grease resistance in food packaging. They're in our cosmetics, building materials, medical devices, and really that's just to name a few. So for many of those uses like healthcare and electronics, there's currently no replacements for PFAS. And it would really take years to develop alternate chemistries for these uses. In these cases, we refer to those PFAS, they're considered to be an essential use. But what we're seeing now is there's regulations that are targeting the non-essential uses of PFAS in consumer products, food packaging, and firefighting foam. So where do we find PFAS in our daily lives? Virtually everywhere. But now all of that promise of PFAS has transitioned to concern, and we see multiple news articles each day telling a much different story. Recently, I saw an article regarding Maine posted a do not eat advisory for wild turkey and deer. And along with all of these articles, what we're also seeing is that PFAS manufacturers are settling lawsuits with multi-billion-dollar payouts to address some of these ongoing concerns with PFAS. So what are PFAS? There's really no consensus definition. The regulatory definitions, every agency has a different definition. They're inconsistent, they're constantly changing and really expanding. Fluoropolymers only became an EPA designated PFAS in September of last year. But the states, Maine and California, really have the most inclusive definition, and they specify that just a single fluorinated carbon, fully fluorinated carbon, to be classified as a PFAS. And under the strictest definition, some of our most commonly used pharmaceuticals are now classified as PFAS. For example, Prozac and Lipitor are. But these medications, they've been used for years. They've been proven to be safe and effective. However, now with this PFAS label, and that PFAS label alone is raising concern. So even when we know that specific PFAS don't pose a risk, the label associated with it is causing concern for consumers. So the one common element of all PFAS compounds is organic fluorine, and that's when a fluorine atom is bonded to a carbon atom. But all PFAS are not created equal. They have different attributes, functions, properties, and toxicity. So this image just provides a real high-level summary of some of those common PFAS groupings. Today, we'll mostly just discuss the non-polymeric PFAS, which is the category in the middle of this figure. And that includes fluorosurfactants such as PFOS and PFOA, which were commonly used in the past, and they're really of the largest concern right now regarding impacts in our environment. So why has PFAS concern risen so dramatically in recent years? So first, they're dispersed across the globe and found virtually everywhere. They can bioaccumulate in humans and animals, and when human blood is tested, they're usually detected. So we've all been exposed to PFAS. And we have seen that there are some direct health impacts that have been reported with higher PFAS concentrations. Some of those are listed here. But new tox studies are indicating that even much lower concentrations may pose an adverse effect, but really more research is needed. Ways in which we can be exposed are via inhalation, skin absorption, but the primary route is really ingestion, and EPA considers ingestion of contaminated water to be a primary route of exposure. So EPA recently finalized drinking water regulations to add with reducing this exposure. So now I'm going to pass the presentation to Steve to discuss some of those federal regulations and drinking water regulations.
Thanks, Linda. So as Linda said, these compounds are pretty ubiquitous and really are starting to show that they may have some significant health impacts. So the EPA recognizing that and recognizing that the public was really anxious to see what safe levels were, not only in drinking water, but also in clothing they may come into contact with or surface waters, they needed to come up with a strategy to address these things and determine what they were going to regulate. So they came up with the PFAS strategic roadmap. And it had 31 targeted items that they were trying to address. And they all were trying to address restricting how much PFAS is released to the environment, figuring out how best to remediate that, and then doing a lot of research with regard to these toxicology studies and even cleanup methodologies, where we didn't really know a lot and still are trying to learn what the best way to move forward is. Next slide. So this year, there's been a couple of things that the EPA have come out with that are particularly important to municipalities and to industries. And the very first and foremost is the drinking water quality standard. They established that PFOA and PFAS, those are the two most dominant compounds that have been used in the past, have MCLs or maximum contaminant levels in drinking water of 4 nanograms per liter. Now that equates to 4 parts per trillion. So that is basically as low as the labs can test for, and really speaks to the potential hazard posed by those compounds in drinking water. The EPA also set levels for PFHXS, PFNA, and a substitute compound for PFOA and PFAS called GenX. And those are all at 10 parts per trillion. And then they also have something called a hazard index for a mixture of compounds. And that involves some math and division by particular indicators. But basically, it limits your concentrations down to that part per trillion level. So monitoring needs to be completed by 2027 by any public water supplies. They have to begin informing the public of the presence of any PFAS beginning in 2027. And by 2029, solutions have to be implemented to remove these PFAS from the water supplies. So this is going to result in a lot of money being expended, not only in monitoring, but also in coming up with remedies for these compounds in your drinking water supply. Next slide. The second really important thing that EPA came up with was naming PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances in accordance with what we all call the Superfund law. And that basically means that any releases that have PFOA or PFOS in them, any releases to the environment above 1 pound per 24 hours means that you need to report it to the National Spill Center. You need to actively perform mitigation and cleanup of that. And if it's been happening for a while, just like any other hazardous substance that might be released, you've got to go look and see where the extent of your impact is. In addition to that, federal facilities need to disclose if they've ever used or released PFAS. And as I said, this is part of the Superfund law. So any Superfund sites that are out there have had to go back and look again at what their conditions are and whether they had PFAS, and do they have PFAS associated with their sites. And to date, there are 7 in Connecticut that have been identified. There are little blue dots there. And those folks are in the process of evaluating what is the extent of impact and what more they have to do with these sites to do cleanup. And at some Superfund sites, it's almost like they've been thrown back to square one for assessment and cleanup of those properties. Next slide. So who needs to worry about this CERCLA designation? As Linda said earlier, PFAS are everywhere. They're in all of our consumer products. And that means that they're in things like landfills. They're in the wastewater that goes down to municipal wastewater treatment plants. And because these compounds are so resilient and resistant to breakdown, PFAS actually pass right through a wastewater treatment plant and get discharged to surface water. So if you've got PFOA or PFAS in your wastewater, does that mean you're going to fall into this Superfund regulation? Well, the EPA was aware of this and aware of how ubiquitous these compounds are. And they've written this policy that there's a link to here. And it basically says that they're only going to go after folks who manufactured or used PFAS in manufacturing. They're going to go after federal facilities, so DOD, DOE, those types of folks, and industrial parties. They're not going to go after municipal landfills, water utilities who might have carbon that they've used to filter PFAS that they need to get rid of, municipal airports, local fire training facilities, farmers who may have had biosolids spread on their fields. They're not intending to enforce this regulation on those particular folks who, in many cases, didn't use PFAS, but are receiving PFAS, like landfills and wastewater plants. Next. The last thing and most recent that the EPA has done is set out this new aquatic life criterion. There's two things here. Generally, the concentrations that are deemed to be safe for aquatic biota are higher than what we see in the drinking water standards. So that's great news, in that it's a little bit higher than the drinking water standard. Wastewater treatment plants and other folks who may discharge waters will benefit from that. But it also is setting the table so that Connecticut can begin to look at what their surface water standards should be. So anticipate that that's going to happen in the near future. Next. So next, for state regulations, Malcolm's going to talk about a few things, and then I'll come back and talk about a couple others. You're muted, Malcolm.
Yep, Malcolm, you're on mute.
Boom. Sorry about that. The DEEP and other agencies with the state set up their interagency task force, and they held a series of public meetings where they discussed the state's plans and got input from various stakeholders and what might be done. Their plan mirrors very much what has been laid out by the federal level, minimizing exposure, containing releases, identifying, assessing, and clean up historical releases, and generally providing education outreach to the community. Next slide. The health-based guidance values for 10 PFAS compounds have been issued. These are action levels. And they are applicable to both public water and to private well systems. The EPA MCLs only apply to the public water systems, but this is something that can be used in application to private wells. And there are approximately 300,000 private wells in Connecticut, and Connecticut DPH has a good deal of concern about exposures to public to PFAS compounds in these, but it's very hard to regulate. Well owners are responsible for their own testing. They're hoping that during house sales that there'll be testing of wells that will include PFAS as well, but this is something of concern to DPH. Next slide. The remedial criteria. Currently, the state is regulating on the sum of 5, some of the more common compounds that are detected, and they're listed at the bottom there. But they had not promulgated a surface water protection criteria yet. We've been in communication with DEEP and their leads who are dealing with this issue, and there's going to be a transition on the state level where they're going to be generating standards for the 10 PFAS compounds on the previous slide with action levels. But that still leaves many compounds out there without alternative alternatives criterion. And for a lot of the compounds out there, there's a scarcity of human and ecological data that could be used to generate that. And I'm going to talk about that more in the case study that'll be presented later. And now I'll pass over to Steve again.
Sure. So the state of Connecticut is also implementing some monitoring that needs to be required for any discharge permit holding entities. So these would be industrial facilities that have industrial discharges and for municipal wastewater facilities. For the industrial wastewater permits, the permits that are being issued are requiring that industries monitor for PFAS. It requires them to utilize qualified professionals to collect the samples and to have them analyzed, and that a sampling plan will need to be generated by the permittee for DEEP approval to make sure that these samples are being collected in the right places and using the right methods. And then once DEEP receives those initial screening samples, there's going to need to be some characterization, identification of, where in your facility are these PFAS being added, and then they're going to determine whether they need to regulate how much PFAS is in the discharge. Next slide. For municipal water pollution control facilities, in the general permits that they're issuing, there are requirements, again, for monitoring of PFAS. They're hoping to have these out and pretty consistent by midsummer of next year. The thought is a qualified professional will need to collect samples twice a year. It'll be from the influent at the headworks, the effluent, where your discharge is, and of the sludges being collected. Those data will be provided again to DEEP for them to really look at what is the cost going to be to do this consistently, and is there any need for source reduction treatment, those kinds of things at wastewater treatment facilities. So this is probably a couple of years off, but this testing is going to begin very, very soon. Next. And there's a couple of bills that were passed last year that really impact municipalities. One is PA 24-59, which talks about banning use of PFAS in a number of different products. But the one that I think is really most important to municipalities is the ban on the use and sale of biosolids as a soil amendment. So as of October 1st, no one can use or sell any soil amendment that utilizes biosolids or wastewater sludges. So malignite, those kinds of things that have been commonly available, they're no longer going to be available for sale. The real important thing to notice here is that the language says that contain PFAS. It doesn't have any concentration. It's PFAS at all. So any detection of any PFAS. This is a lot different than what they had a couple of years ago, where they just talked about the regulated compounds in Connecticut, and there was a 1.4 part per billion concentration allowed. Now we're talking about none, so less than a part per trillion. Next. So again, I said there were a couple of laws put into place. One is Act 191, and the other is 2459, which we just talked about. In addition to that biosolids related issue, these bills ban what is called intentionally added PFAS to not only food packaging as of January this year, but also to essentially nearly all consumer products that you and I would buy. So things like waterproof jackets, furniture, carpeting, the plastic liners for putting up on the windows during the winter. Think of pretty much anything that might be non-stick, water-resistant, water repellent. And for right now, they all have to be labeled as PFAS containing. But as of 2028, they have to no longer contain intentionally added PFAS. And Linda's going to talk about what these bills across the nation are calling intentionally added in the next sections. Next slide. Okay, so state level testing. There has been in Connecticut a number of materials tested for PFAS, and this will tell you just exactly how universal PFAS is, and lots of materials that we're exposed to every day, but also the extent to which these things are going to have to be addressed and may need mitigation. So UCMR 5, this is a monitoring requirement that EPA has for large-scale public water systems. And for the last couple of years, there's been 19 PFAS that have been looked at that that need to be identified in these public water supplies to see, are there other PFAS other than the 5 or so that EPA set the standards for? Are there others that are around frequently that need to be addressed? And this table is kind of complicated, but basically it indicates that about 20% of the public water supplies in Connecticut showed PFAS, PFOA and PFAS being the most frequently seen, and that of the 25% of those samples that came up with PFOA and PFOS, almost every one of them exceeded the new EPA MCL. So nearly 90 public water supplies are going to need to treat their water for PFAS. And then on top of that, there's 10% that have these other compounds that may be regulated very soon in the future. Next slide. At the water pollution control facilities, there was a study that was performed in 2021, 2022. WestonAndSampson was part of that. They sampled 35 targeted wastewater treatment facilities 2 times over the course of a year. Also, the sludge incinerators were sampled, and at 10 locations, surface water and fish tissue samples were collected. It's a very extensive report. There's tons and tons of data, but the big takeaways that I want folks to know about are every water pollution control facility reported PFAS in their influent and effluent. So it's coming out of all of us, and it's getting into the treatment facilities. In addition, every single fish tissue had PFAS in it. So the surface waters are being impacted by PFAS, and not just by the water pollution control facilities, but by other things too. But these impacts are throughout our environment. All of the surface waters had PFAS identified, except for the Connecticut River, I think because it's so big and dilute, and the Still River. And then the incinerator sludges and scrubber waters. So what's coming out of the incinerators after the biosolids are incinerated, so the ash and the scrubber waters actually continue to have PFAS present in them at the same levels as what was being put into the incinerators. So the PFAS are not being destroyed in the incinerators. The ash and the scrubber waters are going to need to be handled as hazardous substances and cleaned, in addition to just dealing with the sludges that have been put through them. So next. And then lastly, as Malcolm alluded to, there's a lot of PFAS out there on a lot of hazardous waste sites that need some attention and need to be discussed in order to close those sites. And unfortunately, we don't know what the background concentration of PFAS is. In other words, there's PFAS that's being deposited in rain, from air, from industrial stacks, and from things like landfills and wastewater treatment facilities and aerosols. So there's a study planned that the USGS is going to do in combination with DEEP to try and determine what is the background level, what is a typical level of PFAS that we see in areas that don't have PFAS sources, so that we can start to put our hands around, is what I see at my site more than what is typical or less than what's typical, and we don't need to worry about it. That is going to be really important, because right now, any PFAS detection results in needing to go through the whole process of the waste site program. Next slide. So I'm going to hand it off to Linda, who's going to talk about how hard it is to actually test for these compounds and how to use the data that you may find.
Hi, thanks, Steve. So I really could spend an entire hour getting into the details of PFAS testing, but we'll save that for another date. Today, I'm only going to be highlighting some details related to the testing relevant to our presentation. So with regard to targeted PFAS, there really is only a small subset of PFAS compounds that can be tested using published EPA methods. So if you remember early on, I talked about the PFAS definitions. There's really tens of thousands, maybe more PFAS compounds. And we're just not capturing all of those with targeted testing. Depending on the method or the laboratory, the list of targeted PFAS varies anywhere from 20 to 100 different compounds. EPA has been slow. That we've had some published methods for drinking water, but it's really been slow to get a published finalized method for matrices other than drinking water. And method 1633, which does address all matrices other than drinking water, was only finalized earlier this year. So in the meantime, laboratories were creating modified versions of existing test methods for other matrices, and they were also expanding those compound lists based on their clients' request, up to potentially 100 compounds by some labs. But these methods, I really can't stress enough, it's really very technically difficult. It's the instrumentation, method complexities, and the ubiquitous nature of PFAS in the laboratories. So while you're seeing these PFAS tests done routinely, it's really not a routine test. We're dealing with detection limits that are in the part per trillion range. Meanwhile, our regulations are in the part per trillion range. So really, we are regulating at the edge of detection. So slight variability in results at those low level can really be the difference between whether you are above or below those regulatory limits. So there's tens of thousands of compounds. How do we start detecting these other PFAS? So we refer to something called PFAS precursors. And those are PFAS chemicals. They're not part of that targeted list, but those precursors can degrade in the environment into terminal products. And a terminal product is just a compound which can't degrade any further. So a lot of these PFAS precursors will degrade into carboxylic acids. This figure on the right is just a great example of how complex this network of precursors compounds are. So all of these compounds in the figure can degrade to PFOA in the environment, but with standard targeted testing, we would only detect that PFOA compound at the very center of this figure. So this figure is just for PFOA. We could develop similar figures for all of the carboxylic acids of varying carbon chain lengths. So this just provides you with an indication of how complex the world of PFAS really is. So how do we go about testing for precursors? Researchers and labs have developed a method they refer to as total oxidizable precursor analysis. In this case, a sample is treated with a strong oxidant to degrade those complex PFAS into those simpler terminal products, and they can be detected by targeted PFAS methods. There's really so many technical challenges associated with this method. I'd love to get into them, but that's really a discussion that would be better suited offline just for time limits. So the figure on the right just shows us all of those classes of organic fluorine. What's highlighted are those classes that we could detect using top analysis. And top analysis is used as a proxy for total PFAS in samples. However, you can see from this figure that would really provide a low estimate for total PFAS. I'm starting to see regulations are now specifying specific PFAS and their potential precursors in consumer products. But, there's no currently approved method for top analysis. EPA is developing one, but here's just another case of the regulations really driving the science when it comes to PFAS testing. When we get into consumer products, there's a couple of methods that have been used recently. And that's many of the consumer product regulations will set limits based on organic fluorine. The California laws are based on 100 ppm as measured as organic fluorine, but there's no final approved method for organic fluorine in products or really in any material. So to fill that void, commercial labs have developed an extractable organic fluorine method. It involves taking that sample, extracting out the organic compounds using a solvent, and then they combust that extract, that solvent extract, and use ion chromatography to measure organic fluorine. And again, this figure on the right kind of highlights those compounds or classes of compounds you would see by this extractable organic fluorine method. And you can see it doesn't capture everything. The EOF method is used as a proxy for total PFAS, but it really also provides a low biased estimate. EPA and ASTM are working on developing a standard method for this test. EPA published a final method earlier this year for adsorbable organic fluorine in aqueous samples as another proxy for total PFAS. They note that this method can be used for monitoring under the Clean Water Act. And again, with the figure on the right, you can see that this method also does not capture all of the organic fluorine in a sample and would also produce a low biased estimate for total PFAS. One of the things we're seeing with consumer product testing is PFAS screening laboratories are using a subtraction method to report total organic fluorine in consumer products. And, if we were talking like simple algebra, this method does seem reasonable. If you have total fluorine, it's just the sum of the inorganic fluoride and organic fluorine. So then you would conclude that organic fluorine can be calculated by measuring total fluorine, subtracting inorganic fluoride to provide you with an estimate for organic fluorine. However, it's just not that simple. Organic fluorine cannot be reliably measured in samples with a complex matrix. For this method, they use a water buffer solution to extract inorganic fluoride from the material, but it's not effective. So imagine putting wax into water. You'd never be able to extract the fluorine out of that complex wax matrix. So if this inorganic fluoride method is providing results that are biased low, when used in this calculation, the organic fluorine results that you get would be biased high. And what we've seen, and depending on sample matrix, in some cases, we get high organic fluorine results by this method that may be entirely inorganic fluorine. So we've talked a bit about PFAS and how challenging the method is, but for a minute, I'm just going to use an analogy. Instead of talking about PFAS testing, let's just talk about construction. It seems unrelated, but hopefully we'll get there. I don't know if any of you have tried to find a contractor recently. I recently tried to find a contractor. Of course, I wanted high quality, reasonable pricing and, within their proposed timeline, and it was a huge challenge. Now imagine if housing development suddenly increased by an order of magnitude year over year. So now think about how difficult it would be to find an experienced contractor to build your house on time and within a reasonable budget. It would be a challenge, if not impossible. But what you would find is anyone with a hammer would show up and claim that they can build you that house. This is exactly what's happening with PFAS testing now. PFAS testing is a huge growth market for laboratories. Testing is increasing by more than a factor of 10 each year based on discussions I've had with friends working in the field. And every laboratory is jumping into the game. If they can buy an LC mass spec, they believe that they can run PFAS tests. But PFAS testing really is a very difficult specialty method, and it's difficult to do well. I even see good laboratories struggling with the method. And often these labs are at or well beyond their testing capacity, and that causes delays in the process. So labs, they're constantly training their staff, but once trained, those team members can go sell their experience to another firm for a greater salary. And, experienced PFAS chemists are in such high demand that labs are seeing lots of turnover of their experienced qualified staff. So if we continue with this construction scenario, my role would be building inspector. And what I'm seeing is levels of quality from the shack on the left to the mansion on the right. Now, the mansion on the right really is representative of PFAS testing, as it's one of the most complex analytical methods that's routinely being performed these days. I'm also seeing data from lots of different laboratories. And another challenge I'm having is trying to merge all those data into a single cohesive compiled data set so that I can assess and analyze the data. And it's really difficult. So even when I'm working with good laboratories, there's variability between the compound lists they report, their detection limits, and then there's an inherent bias in the results from the laboratory. Sometimes when you start combining data and looking for trends and differences, some of those differences you see are due entirely to inter-laboratory variability between the labs. So my advice is, whenever possible, it's best to find a quality experienced lab and to stay with the same laboratory throughout the duration of your project. So there are multi-million-dollar decisions being based on PFAS testing data. And if these data are not reliable, the foundation of those financial decisions are not solid. Getting good quality PFAS data takes, proactive planning, effort. It may increase program costs, but those proactive costs, they can be planned, QA can be scheduled, and those costs can be budgeted. Whereas costs associated with the impact of poor quality data, that what I'm referring to in the slide as reactive costs, you can't plan for them, you can't schedule them, you can't budget them. Those costs may involve complete rework, scheduled delays, not getting the data you need. It could increase your design costs, or maybe your design won't be appropriate because the data were inaccurate. And it can also lead to ineffective litigation support. So with proper proactive QA planning and oversight, your team should be able to generate data that are suitable for your current project needs, but able to support those high value decisions and can be repurposed to help support future needs such as litigation. We have a couple of case studies to discuss today. The first involves supply chain analysis. So PFAS can be introduced into your product or manufacturing stream really at any stage of the product life cycle. In some cases, the suppliers might not even be aware that their product has PFAS contamination. And that's all because modern supply chains are complex. They're global in nature. They may be multiple levels deep. Suppliers may change the composition over time without proper notification. And PFAS ingredients, those new ingredients are considered proprietary, so they may not even be listed on the safety data sheets that you receive. We refer to, there's intentionally added PFAS, which is added for a specific function, but what we're also seeing is a lot of indirect or unintentional addition of PFAS into products. These can occur from things such as recycled plastic, or even if your local water that you're using has contamination. Generally, these levels are at low concentration, but these low concentrations can still be detectable and can be of concern to your consumers. So in this case study, we were working with a client to help them remove PFAS from their wastewater discharge and from all of their manufacturing. So the first pass, we identified those known PFAS sources and we removed them from the process, but PFAS was still in the wastewater. The next stage of this project, we tested all suspect materials for PFAS, and we found some. And again, those sources were removed, but PFAS was still in the wastewater. So finally, all of the products were tested by top analysis to see if we had potential PFAS precursors. And we started finding evidence of precursors, unintentionally added precursors in the supply chain materials. In fact, one ingredient, which is broadly used in household cleaning products, contained PFAS contamination unknown to that supplier. So really, you know, another word of caution is when you're dealing with vendor disclosure statements, they can't be blindly trusted. You really need them to provide you with testing data to support their disclosure of no PFAS. And Malcolm will discuss our next case study from a plating facility.
Yes, next slide, please. This site, you can see a photograph on the right side. It was actually a fairly nasty PCB site, and we spent a number of years negotiating with the state a way to achieve closure, and the site was then remediated under a DECD grant. And you know, we began the process of moving this site towards verification, and in going through the phase 1 history of the site, there was a plating operation that was small one. They only plated trinkets, just little bits and pieces of metal, and then there was a plating bath area, and then they discharged the water from the tank into a pretreatment tank, and then it would be neutralized and sent off to the WPCF. In our testing, we found that the former plating bath area was clean, but the pretreatment tank was not. Next slide. You know, and then we began our testing in March of 2019 and did a series of tests on a quarterly basis. We were doing quarterly monitoring for all other contaminants at the site and trying to move it towards verification. And when we first contacted the regulators about what we had found, we were talking about that we believe that there was off-site background coming on to the property, and then there was a source area that we had identified, and then we had additional wells downgrading, which would be for compliance. And on the left slide there, we have PFAS, PFOS, where you know, you can see that we definitely have a source area. The line in green is very much higher than the background well, and then also the source area, the downgradient well. Whereas for another compound that's commonly detected out there is PFBS, or the butane sulfonic acid. You can see the green is actually less than what was coming onto the site, that it was background. And you know, we were discussing this with the state and trying to work through the issues. And next slide, please. We were able to come up with some plots that clearly indicated that we were dealing with two different populations. We took the data and determined the fraction of each of the components in the samples that were detected. And you can see that the upgrading is dominated by PFBS, but that we're not seeing, you know, and that was the major component coming on from offsite. But if you look at our source area wells, you can see that it is definitely PFAS and the hexasulfonic acid that were being detected. So you can see, you know, these graphs here very clearly showed to the regulators that we were dealing with two different sources. And back in 2018, when we did this testing, there was a lot of disbelief on the part of the regulators, but now, you know, they're getting more and more data, and they're starting to see how common and ubiquitous these compounds are in groundwater. And then, you know, the last one is, you know, the downgradient. You can see it's kind of a mix between the upgradient and the source area. So, you know, that's what we're seeing at our compliance points. Next slide, please. So we're working with the state trying to determine, what we can do to achieve compliance here. We did our background evaluation, and there's pretty much accepted that, we have compounds running onto the site from other unknown sources. We have no idea as to where they're coming from, but and we wouldn't be able to find it out because this is sites in an urban environment. And then we've been talking about alternative surface water protection criteria, and we're about to put in a large submittal with alternative criteria proposed. And what we, as we discussed earlier, the state is going to switch how they regulate these compounds. For the 10 that have action levels, we were asked not to submit on those because the state wanted to work through their own calculations and come up with those numbers. But we still have another 10, 11 compounds that we need to generate criterion for. For some of those, there's sufficient toxicology data now. Back in 2018, 19, those data didn't exist, but they're available now. So we're able to generate surface water protection criteria and the other standards that we need for that. However, for some of the compounds that we've detected, there's just no toxicology data out there available at all, and we've discussed that with the state. And what we're going to do is select certain surrogates that are similar in how they act in the environment and how they affect ecological and human receptors, and suggest a surrogate that we could use to generate a compound specific surface water protection criteria. So, if you've got a site and there are issues out there, DEEP requires testing. They are rejecting verifications if they believe that the site has a SEEK code or other code activities that would indicate the use of PFAS at the facility. Plating facilities are an obvious one. That's way back when EPA put out a directive that if plating facilities weren't going to vent their plating baths, that they could use PFAS compounds to over the surface of the water to restrict emissions. And so, plating facilities, but also there's a long list of other sites that could have manufacturing use of a PFAS. It's causing a lot of sites to be parked. Completed the remediation at that one site back in 2017, and we have been unable to verify because of this development. That's a real concern, and the state is working hard to get things moving forward. The one thing that there is a large list of PFAS compounds. I would warn against maybe not, if the lab says, oh, we can do 50 via this test, maybe not do them all because, maybe you have certain uses at your site where you can say, we suspect that these few compounds were used at our property, and that was, the SEEK code and the industrial uses indicate just these compounds, because you run into the problem. Only 10 are going to be regulated by the state. There's toxicology data for some of them, but not all of them. So, make sure that you select your analyte list correctly. Another issue is the completion of investigation forms that have to be submitted. You're going to need to do, if you do have background coming onto the property, delineation to non-detect is not going to happen. That's a no-go. So you've got to do evaluation of what is background, what is on your property, and then kind of demonstrate through some mechanism. We're using the star plots to show that we've delineated our impact area due to on-site sources, but the rest of it is just, background, and that's the best we can do. So then, and then finally, we are going to get the surface water criteria for the 10 that the state have developed action levels for. When that's going to happen, I've been talking to them since 2018, and we still are waiting for surface water protection criteria. They're a lot closer, but we'll have to see. And then the selection of surrogate compounds. That's entertaining. That's, so I always say, don't collect any data unless you know what you're going to do with it. And for PFAS, it's definitely an issue. So make sure that you select your analyte list, you stick with your analyte list, talk to the agency if your analyte list is correct, and then you have to work through the other issues as they come along. And next slide. Pass it back to Linda and Steve.
Hey, Chuck, I was wondering at this point where if there's any questions that have been submitted to the Q&A, we can start talking about those.
No, actually, thank you, Linda. I was just checking, nothing yet, and I was just putting up a notice saying 5 minutes left. So if you have any questions, please let us know.
So WestonAndSampson is really prepared to handle many of your needs when it comes to site investigations and with relation to PFAS. We do have a brochure for our PFAS related services, which we will be providing to you along with the slide deck after this presentation concludes. Steve, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I'd just like to, reiterate that this is a really fast-moving situation, and the potential impacts for municipalities are absolutely massive from a dollar and cents standpoint. Regulations with regard to water treatment, I think everyone's seen is coming along, and they're addressing, with some relative speed. But the issues with regard to wastewater treatment and even those water treatment residuals, so things like I said, ion exchange resins, the carbon used to filter PFAS out of your water, how you dispose of those, how you destroy any PFAS that is continuing to reside there is going to be something that has to happen very soon. And I'm not sure there are a lot of alternatives out there, but they're coming along pretty quickly. Not quite as quickly as the regulations, but they're coming along. And if you have those kinds of issues, we'd be happy to try and help you out with it. And if we can't do it, we can direct you to some of our other vendors and even other firms out there that have experience with dealing with those kinds of residuals and other problems.
All right. Well, again, no questions that I see so far. So thank you, thank all of you very much, and the attendees. Thank you for attending. As you can see, we've got Linda's, Steve's, and Malcolm's contact information here. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact any or all of them directly.
We do have a question, Chuck.
Oh, we do. Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can we send biosolids for use outside of Connecticut?
Thank you.
It depends on the state. I know that New York is receiving biosolids and sludges all the way out in Niagara. And also, you may be able to use some landfills in Connecticut, but for beneficial reuse, it's going to have to go outside of New England. Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, they've all got land application, either requirements in place or bans in place at this time.
All right. Thank you, Steve. As I was starting to say before, so after this, unless you have any questions for the folks on your own, we will be the recording for this will be available, as will our brochure, and obviously you've got the contact information here, and you also get a PDF of the slide deck. So with that, we'll give everybody a minute back to their lives. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your week, and hope to catch up to you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.